he talked about, and some small press publishing that I also do. I've been teaching for a number of years at the Second Street Writers Workshop in Brooklyn. So the talk that I'm giving today is very much adapted from that. What I want you to bear in mind is that this talk is often when I give this, it's for a very small group and with a lot of trying to talk to people very directly about their work, which isn't going to be possible just because of numbers and because of Zoom and things. But I would ask you to please err on the side of asking questions or asking about how to apply things that I'm talking about in this talk to your work. This is sort of, it ends up being better the more interactive we can make it, despite sort of technological difficulties with that. So bear that in mind. And I'm going to talk to you about characters. Specifically, I think that, as my understanding of the summit is that you're sort of going from the sort of raw idea, the sort of spark of inspiration, the light bulb above our head up here, to kind of over the course of today, getting really into the weeds of starting to, okay, I have this idea, how do I start to put flesh on it? How do I start to tell the story that I want to tell in the world? And then we're sort of going to be moving toward finding the energy to complete it and shape it, and then ultimately, publish it and sell it out in the world. So one of the key parts of that putting flesh on the story is characters. Clearly, the way that I like to think about characters are, if people are familiar with, this is always like a weird question that I don't think I've ever gotten a yes answer to this, but I will ask this. Are people familiar with voodoo and the Lawaz? Or the idea of like how voodoo ritual possession works? Yes, okay, great. I figured with like, okay, excellent. I figured with like a number of folks. I will explain it to those who do not know the laws, right? All right. Basically, the idea is that you have a sort of ritual ceremony. You have the congregation comes together, and you have these laws, which are the like spirits, gods of the voodoo pantheon, right? There's a whole number of them, Papa Legba being the main one. There's like Baron Samedi, for people who are James Bond fans may have encountered this person. Oshun, Yamaya, various ones. Each of them has things that we know about them, that we sort of prepare the ritual space in order to invite these people into it. And then there are sort of priests and people who are trained to receive these beings, right? So you'll go in there, you'll have the space set up to receive these beings, you'll take these ritual actions, and then suddenly these spirits will kind of descend on people in the circle. And suddenly you're interacting with these people. They're actually there among you, right? Like you can talk to Baron Samedi, you can talk to Papa Gede, you can talk to Papa Legba, you can talk to Yamaya, ask them things, make deals, just have this very direct and personal relationship, right? I think that this is what, it's a very embodied form of religion compared to, I don't know, something like my main like personal experiences are often with Christianity, which is sort of fairly remote, right? Like there's this idea that you don't necessarily feel personally close to the pantheon. And these, yes, like Patrick Swayze and Ghost, exactly. And that's kind of, we as writers, when we're readers, we're coming to books to try to get this sense of intense embodiment. Tulpas is interesting. I don't know that much about it, Luke. But yeah, I think that that's the basic idea of like mental models of other people, right? That as readers, we just want to interact with these characters. We want to have this like intense sense of life that's coming through the work that we really feel like, and this is sort of intuitively how we talk about characters, right? Like we talk about thing of Pride and Prejudice, we think we know the Bennett sisters, right? If we think of Moby Dick, we know Captain Ahab, these different things. We want to have that sense of life coming through as readers. And also as writers, we need to be doing, in order to produce this sense of life, I'm going to argue that we want to do this not just so that we're serving the reader well, but so that we have a path that's taking us through the actual work of writing the book. In other words, we want to do the work to put ourselves in the position of perhaps not Patrick Swayze, but the medium, Whoopi Goldberg in Ghost, rather, right? I believe I haven't seen Ghost all the way through. I just know the Mad Magazine parody from my misspent youth. But I know that people will get possessed and are sort of being bridges for these spirits that are coming through, right? We want to put ourselves in the position to allow our characters to possess us. To feel when we're, I think, in a good place with our writing. Yeah. When we're in a good place with our writing, when we feel like it's sort of assembling ourselves, I'm hoping people have experienced this, you know, in their own lives, like when you feel like you're not even necessarily writing, like something is writing through you, like something is sort of making it very easy to suggest what these characters would do. I think I had a teacher at my MFA program named Alma Luz Villanueva, whose book I'm reading right now, so she's on my mind, right? She was talking about having this experience with her book, The Ultraviolet Sky, where she had gotten pretty far into it. I think like 200 pages, 250 pages, something like that. And she said, all of my characters walked out on me. I suddenly didn't know what they were doing. I couldn't imagine what they were happening. Everything was just blocked, right? And she was, these notes in the chat about people who have had these experiences make me happy, by the way. So she's sitting there totally unable to proceed with the book. And the way she always described it was that she was taking a shower one day and she finished sort of steam, imagine sort of like steam in the bathroom, the sort of heat and everything that's going on, right? And she pulls the shower door open and suddenly she says her main character is waiting there for her, like looking at her as she's just gotten in the shower in this fairly vulnerable place across this bathroom, right? And her character looks her in the eyes and says, take it or leave it, bitch. And she always followed up the story by saying like, and I took it. She threw away almost everything she'd done. I think it was like she cut it down to like maybe 30 pages of material she thought was okay, and then rewrote the book just with this character who had sort of shown up very intensely in her life at that moment, right? And continued forward. I think that this is where we want to go. So what I want to talk about today are some mechanisms for making that easy to do with your main character, for some mechanisms for making that easy to do with some of the additional characters, and for a third technique, if we have time, which I think we will, just to be able to start to build out a sense of a world as something other than a single lens that we're moving through it, which has some of its own pitfalls, right? So the method that I want to present for this is what I call either 5-point characters or quick characters done cheap. I'll tell you what that is in a moment, but it's basically, I think there are 5 questions that in my experience have been, if I can answer these questions about a character, then it's as if I'm sort of in the voodoo priesthood able to summon this character, right? Like if I, for example, if I know that, I'm going to get the associations wrong, but if like Papa Legba likes chicken, white rice, and like whiskey, right? Knowing those facts allows me to embody Papa Legba, to sort of allow that character's perspective to take me over and sort of lead me into the story and know what Papa Legba is going to do in any moment, right? These are 5 things that I think tend to give you insight into a character. I will go through them and sort of why I think they're important. I'm going to preface this also by saying that, oh my gosh, it's an actual voodoo priestess here. That's exciting. I hope I'm doing, Stanislavski method is also like, definitely, I think that those reading Building a Character was pretty instrumental in bringing this. If people have read An Actor Prepares or like Building a Character, I highly recommend it if you have not. Let me preface these 5 points by saying these are far from the only 5 points you could use. I think, in fact, all of them are optional except one, which we'll focus on at the end. First one being, what's the character's name? This is one that I think that whether or not we end up using the name in the story, I think there's something about knowing how a character has inherited a name that's been chosen from them, or that a character's name, or character has decided to choose their own name, is also a fairly interesting thing, right? Because there's a lot of our basic social experience is very baked into a name, right? We have certainly a sense of gender that's baked into names usually. We have a sense of cultural background is usually baked into names. There's a sense of kind of mythic background in some ways, right? We have, if you happen to be, I think about like a kid who's named like Napoleon or something like that, tends to have, or Samson, tends to have some fairly intense baggage that's coming into it, right? We think of the Johnny Cash classic, A Boy Named Sue, right? There's like a story entirely about a character's struggle with his own name. I think that whether or not this ends up on the page, having some sense of that name and some sense of how it's going to affect a character and some sense of what the meaning beyond acts of renaming that come through is going to be important to think about as part of your sense of overall balancing a character. The second one, where is a character from? This one I like to think of as broad an interpretation as possible as where a character is from. We can refer to that as a very simple thing, like this character is from Plano, Texas, in the United States of America, is like one way to answer that. The character's from an upper middle class home. The character's from an indigent life. The character's from a set of foundational traumas. If we have, oh my gosh, I really like the idea of a character from a cursed life, by the way. Renaming herself Blessed, that's like, that in and of itself is like sort of a delight. That is like enough of for a story, right? Basically having a sense of what the character's coming out of, what gravity's sort of bearing on them as they're moving through, is a way to, if you sort of feel disconnected from a character, you can sort of steep yourself in that place, particularly if it's a place that's close to your own experience, and sort of see what comes up with the character in a moment, right? Another possibility, now this is getting a little bit detouring, but when we want to build out, let me come back to this part about building out the backstory of a character, right? The third of the 5 points. How does a character earn their money to survive? This one, I think, often is one that we don't consciously think about, particularly early on when we're writing. I think a lot of us have the idea of normalizing a character's sense of means to our own, just because it's a very, very, it's a lens that we often find it very difficult to look outside of, right? In terms of, if we tend to come from a middle-class background, assuming that everybody is going to have access to certain things, assuming everybody, oh, thank you, Amy, assuming that everybody has access in particular to the same resources under stress. If a character gets into a situation that they find overwhelming and don't know how to deal with, for example, it's very different if their character has enough money to say like, go on a road trip to like blow off steam, right? Or a character to like travel to a country they've never been before, versus somebody who like has a set of obligations and they're kind of not able to make those moves. Or, a set of like crushing debts, set of dependence. If other people are sort of relying on a single paycheck, for example, exactly like financial resources are really contouring what that character's experience is going to be. So if we're thinking about, when we're writing characters who are very close to our own experience, we can really substitute instinct for a lot of this. When we're writing characters who are distinct from us, one very strong way to vary that is just by having a very strong differential in this point about what there's also the question about what a character does to earn their living, ends up determining how they spend often, a third of their life, who they're going to come into contact with, what their social world is. This is very present to me right now, just because my partner is an essential worker during the pandemic in New York, right? So it's where I'm fortunate enough to be able to work from home. And the differences, despite us being like married and living in the same house, the differences between our experiences is like vast because of this one point, right? Just in terms of who we're gonna who we're going to encounter, how we feel about different things, what we feel our level of safety is in various circumstances. So it's something to bear in mind. Let me take a look at I saw some comments come through that I wanted to get to before the Zoom divide. Terrifying. Okay, if we're talking about prior experience, like from being a prisoner of war, exactly, definitely, that's absolutely something that would fall into that second point. There's a lot of my references for storytelling come from Star Trek Deep Space Nine. I don't know if anybody is fans, but there's this one episode where a character named Miles O'Brien has is charged with a crime on this alien world, and the punishment is to serve like hard time, but they don't want to actually inconvenience people. Exactly, yeah, that episode. They don't want to inconvenience people by like actually taking away those years of their life. So they load like 50 years of memories of prison into his brain. Actually, nothing is like, it takes like 10 minutes or something like that. Like nothing else has happened, but it's sort of, he almost becomes a completely different character as a result of that fundamentally shaping experience, right? It's sort of, which never gets undone at the end of the episode, interestingly. O'Brien Must Suffer episodes are often like kind of, he's a good character to make suffer as well, just because he sort of has this mix of like grit and grievance. He's kind of like a family man. He has like, I don't know, it works. It really works. I'm glad we have a lot of O'Brien fans here. That makes me feel very, very comfortable in this talk. Okay, so let me go through some more questions here, right? About YA, Leah, I think. Someone who almost exclusively writes YA, that's a hard question to answer, but I always try to know the character from the character's parents' perspective. Yeah, exactly. That's, and that can be different too, based on your experience as a kid, what you have. Like I have some, this discussion was cropped up on Twitter, I think recently, where some people were talking about just having, you know, I was born 1983, so I have a certain slice of like video game history as my, in my cultural background, right? The access to these certain things like really comes through having access to this particular entertainment system. I have a friend who I think she's almost exactly my age, has almost exactly my interests in these areas, but just sort of missed a whole section of time because her family was like living in a trailer at the back of her church, I believe, and like didn't have like a TV or anything indoors. So it's sort of like this really intense sense of like, she didn't earn a living directly, but her sense of circumstances was very, very driven by the parents. So I think that's like a really, or like the lack of parents in the, certain stories, I think is very important. Yeah, and again, there's sort of the, Allie brings up the idea of main characters who aren't on the same income level and the sort of plot complications that starts to lead in, right? Where sort of there's a power dynamic starts to set up, resentment starts to set in when this female character starts to feel weird about having this guy paying for stuff for her, right? We see how even with just these 3 out of the 5 points, right, we're already sort of having a sense of these characters, a sense of their world come through. And we see a sense of like, once we put these characters into a frame with one another, which we'll get to over the end here, a sense of some of the very great complications that can happen. Picard in the Piccolo episode also never goes back. Okay, I'm going to move forward. Oh my gosh, rural lifestyle. There are too many good questions. These are really, really wonderful. All right, let me move on to the 4th point, which I think this one is controversial, at least with a couple of friends of mine. Like I was talking to a friend of mine just this week about this one, and he profoundly disagreed, and I'm going to make my case for it here. It's the idea of who is the character going to, if they have a terrible secret or a terrible confession they have to make, who's the person they're going to go to with it first? I believe that in any circumstance, there's always going to be somebody, and it's almost more interesting if it's an extreme reluctance. When you have a character who you want to say the answer is nobody, that almost becomes more imperative to find out what the answer is, right? because I believe very profoundly that we all stand in some form of relation to everybody else, right? It could be an extremely damaged, it can be an extremely sick relation with other people, right? There could be extreme like personal pain that falls between two people on an individual level. There can be extreme social pain with people from very different backgrounds, particularly across like lines of extreme ethnic strife, right? That's still like, it's not as if they live in separate worlds, it's in they live with a very, very damaged relationship between them, right? Based on the sort of historical weight. So I think that given that, and unless you're literally writing a character who's like raised by wolves, right? In which case they're, the sense of who they tell their secret to is like, I don't know, their favorite wolf. There's going to be somebody that we just as social creatures want to stretch out toward, whether we feel that we can or not. My example for this is often the Notes from Underground. Have people read that? Dostoevsky book. Okay, so like, it's basically, a lot of the book is just literally this like extremely miserable Russian man, like in the basement writing notes about his total alienation from society, right? Yeah, I haven't read it in a minute, so this is all my fond memories of Notes from Underground, right? But I remember that a huge, huge proportion of these notes that are just literally musings about society, consensus reality, and how we fit into it, right? A lot of them are directed to or for the benefit of this person, this like random dude who's bumped into him on the street. A lot of this book is almost a deposition, I think you can argue, to this person to explain, this is why you shouldn't have bumped me. This is what I would do in order to take revenge if I had more courage. This is why it's an intense like work of self-defense and self-justification, but there's somebody it's to, right? There's some intent to be observed and to be justified. I think that we all have that, whether we could even, it's even sublimated in some cases into like, oh, like one day the Lord will see what I've done and like judge me to be good, right? I think that that's like a transformed version of the same drive. Yeah, who they trust the most is sort of where this comes down to, right? Let me look through some of the questions here. Okay, so question of like, the character wouldn't want to burden her brother who is years younger, but that's who she would tell a secret to. Brianna says this. That's right. There's sometimes an extreme reluctance about telling these secrets, right? There's a sense of like, but I bet that she's thinking about, what would my brother say about this? Thinking about what would he do in the case. There's some sense of like, there's a story that she's telling herself, right? About what's going to happen with this. And that sort of allows us to tap into that story, that sort of work of shaping and keeping this sort of secret, that work of shaping and keeping like a narrative about her life, right? That starts to create that sense of life to which we can connect when we're writing. Scrolling down, Notes from Underground, Raised by Wolves. Who do you tell your good news to first? Exactly, right? It doesn't have to be the sort of like weighty, like super like Dostoevsky tortured Russian question. There's also this thing about like, who are you excited to talk to? Like, who is it like, the way I've heard this expressed a couple times on Twitter, it's just like, who lives in your head right now? Like, who do these characters have living in their head? Not only is this going to let you connect to a sense of life, but in a moment when we pivot to talking about backstory development, right, this also starts to seed further characters that we can kind of bring out and populate our world with, right? Okay. Yeah, and the idea of like oversharing, that's also an interesting character, right? If the confidant is somebody anonymous? My mind goes to that Hitchcock movie, I think, like Strangers on a Train, where the two men like meet on the train and both decide to enter into this like murder pact with one another just because the anonymity allows them to share a secret in a way that they can't otherwise, allows them to sort of step outside of morality in this way. I really like that question, like what makes you feel safe? Also, I'm going to get, let me come back to that in a moment. So let me come back to that right now, actually. So the 4 that I've talked about to this point, right? This is kind of my secret sauce for when I'm writing my own characters, and I find that I don't necessarily know all that I want to know about them, or I need to feel more connected to them. I need to feel more energy coming through them in some way, right? I think these 4 questions are always helpful, but I think it doesn't have to be these 4. I think that there are any number of other ones, like what makes a character feel safe, for example, is like an excellent other question, right? I think like, what does a character believe in about sort of their, like, where does a character believe they'll go when they die? I think could be a viable question, right? I think like any number of schemes for just finding ways to connect to the character. I encourage everybody to kind of develop your own questions as well that feel very personally relevant to you, especially ones that when you think about people in your lives, like think about, okay, what type of person is this person? What type of person is this person? How you tend to think about the people around you tends to be a very useful way to think about your characters as well. But again, I like the ones that I'm telling you just for, I think they sort of stretch characters in directions that I'm interested in going in, right? But it doesn't matter that it's precisely these, as long as you have these questions. You missed it because we have not gotten to question 5 yet, Kara, which we are about to get to. Question 5, and this is the one that I don't think is optional, right? Is you have to know what your character wants. There's a Kurt Vonnegut quote, which says, every character in a story must want something, even if it's a glass of water. Now, let me clarify a little bit more about what I mean by what a character wants, right? And yeah, Sandy, this sort of gets at that question of motivation, right? The more concrete you can get your characters want, generally the better. Let me back up for a second. The reason the question of what a character wants is so crucial is that is more than anything else, if we're using our sort of voodoo metaphor, if we're taking the characters and like writing them down into the story, sometime we know where we need to go. We feel that connection to the characters. We're just trying to like pour them out onto the page in ways that we've talked about, right? Sometimes we've done that. We sort of have seen characters in various circumstances. We've seen them be rendered. We've seen everything that we've gotten kind of the easy scenes done in some ways, right? But then we're frozen. In addition, extending, Jill, the idea of the theater and the actors, right? It's as if you don't only have to perform the play, but you have to write the play. You have to figure out what this character is going to do without a script, right? In a way that's going to determine everything else about the character beyond that, right? Totally is a difference between what a character wants and what they need. And it's like very important to bear in mind that we don't always, in fact, maybe even not often, want the same thing that we need. Like much great fiction is based on that gap. But when we're kind of in the weeds of a story, knowing what's pulling a character, if we find ourselves lost, if we find ourselves not knowing how to connect to the story, if we find ourselves not knowing how to connect to the character, reminding ourselves of what that central pull is going to allow us to sort of mechanically get that connection and start feeling our way into it. It's like if anybody's had to get like a truck out of the mud, right? It's like the board that you put under the tires is sort of recentering on that character's core desire. Some important caveats with this. I think that we can get into a lot, the questions that I've most often had students bring up with this is, what if my character wants more than one thing? And what if my character doesn't know what she wants? I think these are sort of the same question in a way, right? Because I think that we usually have some sense of at least one thing that we might want in an immediate sense, right? Even if it's like, going back to Kurt Vonnegut, like they want a glass of water, they want like a lunch or something like that. But I think when we start to get into much larger questions, like, okay, what this character wants is justice. What this character wants is like love. What this character wants is redemption. Those become good to know thematically. Those become good to know in terms of like, okay, this is the kind of story I want to tell, right? But how do you sort of sit down and write a character doing that in the same way that like when you're sitting around your house and you think like, okay, what do I want to do today? You're not necessarily, what I want to do today is find redemption, right? You never think that. You definitely, what's going to get you out of bed, what's going to get you out of your house is being able to frame it in the sense of what does redemption look like at a very practical and concrete level, right? Let's take a look at a character who wants justice, right? What concrete, you start to tell very different stories when you break that down into different concrete meanings of justice, right? Perhaps a character wants, in terms of a character wanting justice, perhaps what they want is an apology. Perhaps a character wanting justice means they want a court judgment in their favor. Perhaps they want someone to suffer in the way that they've suffered. And sort of their version of justice is like coterminous with revenge, right? They could want these very specific things, but if you're thinking about, if you're starting to break it down in these concrete ways, then some things start to suggest themselves about what do you need to do to get a court judgment? What do you need to do to get about, to get revenge on somebody? What do you need to do to get an apology, right? And can you do things to get these? There's, you start to see the energy that gets a character out of bed. Yes, I think that the character believing that their goal is achievable is like SP, that sounds exactly right. That there's sort of like a tech world, my day job is involved in tech, so I think in buzzwords some of the times, right? Where it's like good goals are measurable goals in some ways, and it becomes very hard to write a situation of characters who are in paralysis. Going back, because it's front of mind, to Alma Villanueva's book, right? The actual plot is fairly amorphous, right? Like there's sort of 4 kind of broad things that are going on. Like her, she has a late in life pregnancy at one point. Her marriage is breaking up. She's having extreme difficulty with her friend. And I think there's something, there's like her son is in some kind of complicated trouble, right? So all of these threads are sort of things that she's not able to take kind of measurable actions toward, right? Like regarding her marriage, she's like exploring like moving to this mountain town somewhere, right? But that's almost it as far as her little thing. It's like she has like, my friend and I are feeling distance between us. Like you can't just go and attempt to like, there's not a concrete thing you can pursue necessarily with that. Because sometimes that just happens, right? So the book is then centered around a different concrete goal, which is she's working on a painting in her basement studio of like the ultraviolet sky in the title, right? And at every given moment, everything that she learns, the health of her relationships is kind of expressed through her being able to work on that painting, whether she gets diverted into working on a number of other paintings. There's sort of, and this circles back around to talking about a question somebody asked above about whether what the character wants is the same as the theme of the book. Rebecca, I think it was, yes. The theme is a concept I don't tend to work with personally. I think usually in terms of like, I want to express the idea of theme as more something like, what do I want people to take from this book? Like what do I feel like the design of this means to me and something? And I think that the question of how, I think that tends to be most easily encapsulated in terms of like, if a character wants a glass of water, whether they get it or not is sort of gets to the question of the theme, right? Do I believe that people tend to get glasses of water, or that people don't tend to get glasses of water? My story for this is a student I had who's talking about this character all the way through. The character was, I forget their name at this point. I believe it was like Kim, right? Character is a Vietnamese immigrant living in Florence, Italy. The character was worked, I believe, as an artist, a photographer. The closest human connection was his brother, who he'd call, right? And then what he wanted was a cup of like perfectly prepared Vietnamese coffee with condensed milk, right? Served in this one cafe at midnight. And I remember him sitting there after he said this, right? And all of us were kind of, the way he said it was very like dramatic, right? So we all kind of like leaned forward like, and asked like, so does he get the coffee? And he just sat back and said, I think that is theme, right? Like it's something about like, not just that he said no, but the sort of like gravity with which he said it, I think is where like theme starts to come in, right? But okay, that's like the 5 points of characters in my experience, right? Let me pause to take some questions in the chat just about that last one, in particular ways that you're seeing it apply to your own work. Because I think that getting to that point of like, it's one thing to talk about how our goals should be concrete, and another thing sometimes to see how this is going. I'll quickly recap. We need to know a character's name. We need to know where they're from. We need to know how they earn a living. We need to know who they would tell a secret to before anybody else. And we need to know what they want. Who they would tell a secret to, I sometimes talk about as their closest human connection, right? Who they're closest to in the world is another way to phrase that. Yep. Okay, so let me look at some of the questions that are coming through. It's everyone's name is hidden for a moment, but it's somebody whose name starts with AM, who's asking about, what about in romance stories where the ultimate goal, Amy, what about in romance stories where the ultimate goal is to get the characters together, the wants of the characters are usually going against the relationship? Okay, totally. There's some sense in which the characters in romance stories, the story feels like a kind of journey to the characters realizing what they actually want. I'm thinking of like Pride and Prejudice is on mind, right? Where like Elizabeth Bennet doesn't necessarily want to get married to anybody, right? And then sort of realizes that, okay, like as she's meeting Darcy and encountering Darcy, she sort of realizes, okay, this is actually like somebody that I would ultimately like this, right? Darcy's realizing the same thing about her, and a lot of the energy of the book comes from just them both thinking that they've kind of like ruined their chances at this, right? That they can't like their beliefs. Initially, the prejudice is sort of pushing them apart, right? And then the sort of pride is then pushing them apart, and they have to sort of overcome both of these things. I think that often this is the case in romances, is just like people realizing that they need to like sort of overcome these whatever's sort of keeping them away from intimacy over time. I think this connects to what Francisca's talking about with the want changing during the course of the story. I think that is what's sort of uniquely compelling about romance stories, right? Is that usually they don't begin with characters wanting to get into a relationship necessarily, right? Like usually when I think of like really classic love stories, I think about the fact that the characters like absolutely don't usually with the person. Like usually they're think about like, it shows my notion of classic love stories when I think of like, well, gee, like Han Solo and Leia, where it's like, there's sort of a sense that they like, there's an attraction, but they like hate each other for a lot of that story, right? And part of the reason that they hate each other is that they're just like trying to find reasons to deny the thing that they're actually feeling toward one another, right? I think that tends to be compelling to sort of recognize. Earlier we talked about the distinction between want and need, right? Which is, I hesitate to bring up need when we talk about characters, but I think that there's something about that is the energy that's drawing us through romances. And in particular, the fact that we as the reader usually want something that the characters don't. Like we want to kind of shake the characters and realize like, don't you understand? This is the perfect relationship for you. Um, hopefully helpful. Michelle asks, I'd love to hear more about how to handle a young protagonist who's feeling their way for life and they don't know exactly what they want. When I think about some examples, there are sometimes you feel like you know you want the deeper thing and you sort of go after different concrete versions of it that tend to be not as compelling. Like I'm thinking about the structure of Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God in this, where Janie knows that she wants to have this sort of deep connection to life, which is like a sort of poetic way of talking about she wants like adult sexuality and connectedness, right? And she sort of approaches this through 3 marriages, each of which is sort of they get closer to being something that's like a sense of like connectedness to the world, like adulthood in this way. But each of these marriages being sort of the concrete thing that she's trying out. So it's a sense that the character is sort of like arriving at different hypotheses, testing them and finding them, okay, like actually like I don't want to be married to like this like bad gambler or like this like drunken like dude that I'm in a storm with. The plot of Their Eyes Were Watching God is a little far from me at this moment. It's one that I read 20 years ago, but I think that this is even what makes stories about very young people very compelling, is that there really is the sense that they're very open to experimenting with like wildly different lives. I think about The Adventures of Augie March, if people have read that, where it's really Augie just has like a whole set of different jobs that are sort of moving through from like eagle training to like different other things. Suppose that the want is unattainable, Rudian asks. This can get back to what Rebecca was talking about with theme in some ways, right? Where if the one is unattainable, there's something in the course of a character giving it up. Like my mind goes to Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, right? Where the entire book is bent on them getting the Holy Grail, right? The final moment is a realization that they can't get the Grail. They can't reach across far enough to grab it. And Indy's father, who's the person he's almost trying to get the Grail for, finally says, like, Indiana, let it go. I think that there's something very powerful about that, and getting to the question of like, but the fact that they're searching for the Grail still pulls us through like 2 hours of the movie, right? Like every scene of it is sort of subordinated to like, how is this getting us closer to the Grail? Same with Ahab and the White Whale, right? Like every scene they're moving through the ocean closer to Moby Dick. They don't catch Moby Dick. And they know they're not going to catch Moby Dick, because like to do so is basically to like apprehend God, right? It doesn't change the power of the story. Characters who are lying to themselves about what they want, Slita. Yeah, that's like, and there's some additional tension as a reader too, the same with sort of the romance case, right? Where's the question of like how we know, like we as the reader kind of know that sense of irony, where like we know what might be good for you. We know that it's going to be best if you just do this. Like how long can you keep kind of fooling yourself in this way, right? And when we're writing about it, we're sort of playing a game with the reader in that, where we sort of know like, oh my gosh, this character is going to do the thing that's like worst for her. How long can I kind of sustain that in some ways, right? Okay. Scrolling down, these are so many good questions here. I'm writing a memoir based on memories. Wondering if I should invent some new events or new characters to make it more story-like and universal. An interesting question. All of this with memoirs, I think is, I think it's up to you. Like the question of the politics of how, I think as long as you're very clearly saying like, I've introduced characters, I've consolidated characters and things like that, I think that that's okay as long as you're saying that you're doing it in anything that you're publishing under your memoir, right? I think that can also be liberating in some sense. Just with memoirs, I can almost not write nonfiction just because I don't want to write about people I know. Like I just really find it paralyzing to do that outside of the lens of fiction, right? So I think that finding some ways to get more thematic about what we're thinking about the question of like, does a character get their Vietnamese coffee or not? that feels like a pertinent choice to try to add some invented elements to get us closer to that realization, if that's helpful. Let me see, we have some questions coming through. I just am finding the QA points here where we just answered the one from Tobias. Another one from Tobias about, are you familiar with Carl Alesius's emotional core? I am not familiar with that. So if you would not mind explaining that in the chat, you should do it. Mary Randall Hayes asks, if a character wants redemption, what are examples of how they would get it? Interesting. I think that the reverse of the justice, in some ways, a search for redemption is also a search for justice, only you're bringing the justice to yourself, right? Like you're assuming like, I've done bad things and I want to be brought back into full recognition of society. So probably the easiest form of a character seeking redemption is just asking for an apology, right? Like wanting to have, or like some kind of, I question whether redemption and exoneration are the same, right? Like if a character wants their name cleared, that doesn't necessarily feel like redemption in the same way. But a character really feels like, okay, I messed up, I want to do something to make it right. They would probably want to give an apology and sort of seek whatever conditions allow them to give an apology, right? If that's helpful. That would be how I would incline to start thinking about it. And then there, sort of a lot of specific plot would probably come in terms of what barriers are there to giving that apology? Like, is it somebody who wants to hear from them ever again, for example? Is it, would they lose anything substantial socially by giving an apology? Would they have to sort of acknowledge their crimes in a very public way? I have a student right now who's writing some things related to like a really decisive wrong done to her character by somebody in a great position of power, right? Who would, in confessing to this, their redemption would, the character wants to be forgiven, like this person in the position of power wants to be forgiven for having committed these wrongs, but confessing to them is going to lead them necessarily to lose that position, right? Like, what do you give up in order to be sort of brought back into the moral fold? That feels like a very, you know, powerful potential plot, right? Like sort of, it's where it's the fake out in the Shawshank Redemption, right? Where it's like the whole idea is that the main character in Shawshank Prison is going to have to accept that he's also a guilty person in Shawshank Prison. And of course, the story ends up being different than that. Paige asks, can you speak more about how to make those abstract motivations into concrete wants? Yeah, I think like belonging, like we could definitely want to connect with someone else specifically. We can definitely want to connect with somebody around us. Cultivation, we could be wanting to learn a new skill. A character could, in the same way of like, when we get into cultivation, we're starting to almost put ourselves back in the position of like a YA character who's like trying on different lives, right? Like we sort of want to grow, we want to make ourselves better, and we sort of think of these different different ways to go for with that. If that's helpful, like the question of how to break these down into concrete ones almost is the story of a book. And it's sort of, it's the hardest question because it's the one that's should take the most time to be thinking through. Donna Minkowitz asks, what if a character wants two things that are diametrically opposed? Again, like the stuff of great fiction, right? I think that often what happens is characters will sort of pursue things in a self-sabotaging way. They'll pursue the thing that they sort of think they want and then actually be pursuing another thing in a way that's harming the first initiative, right? They could sort of alternate back and forth. They could attempt to decisively renounce one, and then the reader's sort of horrified at the fact that they're doing that. I think that this is just like it's a really, really common thing, but I think like as long as you're thinking, as long as you're trying to answer the question, okay, what does this character want right now? Like there's a moment in Michael Chabon's book, The Mysteries of Pittsburgh, where the main character is involved with a man and a woman and is trying to make a choice between which of them he wants to pursue. And he thinks about what his life would be like with one or the other, right? In my memory, like pages and pages, like sort of going back and forth about it, he finally decides like, okay, like I can't decide anymore. I'm just going to flip a coin, heads or tails. Like heads, I go, heads, I go with this guy, tails, I go with this woman, right? He flips the coin and it comes up heads. And the very next sentence is, I went to see her, or something like that, right? I think there's something really powerful in that sort of, there's a moment where you can force pushing your characters into positions where they really do have to make that choice is, again, the sort of stuff of great fiction. But in terms of, at any given moment, they're going to think that they want to pursue one over the other. And finding that just allows you to sort of do this role of being in the story and writing the characters. We have about 5 minutes left. Daniel, I don't know if you want to give people a break before the next talk. I can easily go for another 5 minutes if you want to do that. But I don't know how how we've generally been scheduling these. No deadline. Okay, let's keep going. Looking at some questions. Leaving Las Vegas, character seems to want to die. Is that what he really wants? I have not seen Leaving Las Vegas. My mind would go to the fact that either, yes, that is what the character really wants, is this sort of annihilation that he's like afraid of. He wants to sort of overcome a limit in seeking that annihilation and overcome that fear. Or he might be putting himself in a position where it seems like that's what he wants in order to be rescued, right? And then sort of the girlfriend allowing him to die is sort of a failure of what he wants on some level. I haven't seen the movie, so I can't speak to that, but that would be sort of occur to me. John Kaiser asks, is it okay to have a character who has no memory and their search is to find out who they are? Absolutely, everything is okay. Like, I don't think there should be rules against like any kind of story. You know, I think that, and that's like a really powerful thing that's leading through it. Like the question of like, who am I goes back to some very basic myths, right? Like sort of people who don't know their parentage, like Oedipus comes to mind, where he's sort of abandoned, doesn't understand like his entire background. I think that that's even in more mundane ways, right? Like all of us, I think universally have some questions about our parents, have some questions about sort of where we come from, some questions about what sort of made the circumstance of our life. I definitely find that's more true of me, especially the older I get. So I think that telling a story that's literally about memory loss is a way to sort of get at those themes in a very, very, very direct way, right? I think that sounds great. And again, there's also the question that even if a character doesn't have a memory, they still have a sense of character necessarily, right? Like certainly their sense of like where they're from is giving you all kinds of information about that character, because like they don't know, and that would be just a constant agony, right? To not actually, like once you become aware that you have a background that you don't know about, I feel like if I were in that situation, I would spend all my time thinking about, oh my gosh, where am I from? Like who was I? Like, is there anybody looking for me? Like you would be, it would determine so much about your life and sort of the moves you make. And I can't imagine anything you want not being very fundamental. Like I can't imagine anybody having that level of amnesia and thinking like, yeah, I guess I don't know where I'm from at all, but what I really want is to become a lawyer, right? Like that's a character that's very hard to even conceive of, like somebody who doesn't mind having an inner life in that way. I think that's just a really powerful character to write. Okay, going through, let me find a good question to wrap up on, because we're almost out here. Conscious thought is creativity. Hour break. Die. Jason Bourne, yes. Daniel David Wallace. I'm not sure about passive experiencing the characters. Subplots, yes. Let me, because I don't really have time at this point to go into the full thing that I wanted to get to, which is starting to think about. Let me just say this, that one of the virtues of having this 5-point character system is that it allows you very, very quickly to create new characters that you can answer these 5 questions for. And it allows you to look at characters that you think that you know, maybe they've even written hundreds of pages about, see if you can answer these 5 questions about them. And if you can't and you're stuck, I guarantee you that part of the reason you're stuck is that, right? The other part of the reason is that recognizing that it's not just our main character who has 5 things, it's every character. It's like the gas station attendant. It's like the cook. It's like the person who like sells the sandwich at the bodega. It's the cab driver. Everybody has, you can answer these questions about everything. If you find yourself lost in, like, to go back to the summit, like lost in the forest of the plot, right? And you find yourself wondering, see who is in there that you can't answer these questions for. Go in and try to answer these questions. See where the answers to these questions lead you, right? As we were alluding to a little bit earlier, if you know a character is from Phoenix, Arizona, maybe you know, how did they feel about that? Where did they go to school while they were there? Did they know anybody else there? If you sort of know who the character will tell their secret to, that person has five answers that you can give to that as well, right? The person they're telling their secrets to also has things that they wanted. Maybe one of the things they want is not to have to provide emotional support to this character anymore, right? You start to see some energy entering the story in this case. And this is kind of the thing that once you get that every character in a story has separate wants that are moving across one another, a lot of things about the conflict in your story and a lot of things about your main character that maybe you can't see, but maybe another character in the story can. And if you sort of spend time with that character, looking at your main character, you might find your way through to the next thing. I also absolutely back up what Paige says. And I think this is where we're going at with subplots, right? Is that subplots are just, every character thinks that their subplot is a main plot. So looking at subplots from that angle and just starting to figure out, okay, how much of this do I actually need? Yes, I do have to take off in a second, but I will tell you, journaling as a character absolutely gives you a sense of who they are. I think that in particular, taking characters that you don't know that much about and journaling as them in the first person, every time I've done that, I've learned something really, really critical. Every time I've done that from a character who isn't my main character, I've learned something really, really important almost immediately about my main character that almost like derails the book in a good way. Highly recommend it. Yo, these questions were great. I usually teach this with like 8 people. I'm not used to having like a huge number of like incredibly good questions, incredibly good energy. All of like everyone's work that they've been talking about seems great. I hope you have a really good rest of the conference. Daniel, is there anything else you want to hear from me before I split here?
No, that's great. Thank you so much. Thank
no
you so much. Just a wonderful reaction to people, and please say thank you. Where can we? Do you want to share your website in the chat?
Yeah, totally.
Is your book available for pre-order?
My book is indeed available for pre-order. Summer Fun is the new one. It's about surf rock in the 1960s. You can get it from here if you want to do that. And please, I've got my, if anybody has follow-up questions, I think I have, my email is linked to somewhere on that website. So please feel free to send me a question if you have anything else you wanted to talk about.
Thank you so much.
Well, Daniel, thank you for putting this together. This is really fun. It was nice to see you, and I hope everybody has a great time with the rest of the summit.
If you want to check, if you need to go, just check out, and I'll just I can wrap up. But everyone, see, we got like an hour break. We've got a wonderful talk about small details. I feel like these 2 talks will work really well together, like motifs, small details. By the way, and then the other thing I want to say is we're almost at 3,000 attendees. If you've got some friends, tell them, because I want to give the 3,000th attendee bonus. So tell your friend, write a friend to show up and register. Thank you so much.
Bye, folks.